society has grown by leaps and bounds in the last century, especially with regards to civil rights. We currently have an African American president, and we have a level of racial integration which seemed impossible. How did we as a society go from slavery and total inequality to the level of equal civil liberties that we have today? It's because of the brave people who risked their lives to fight conformity and for the almost inconceivable theory of equality. These brave people were attacked, arrested, beaten, and completely inhumanely.
January 15, 1929, before the stock market crash, a great man was born. Son of Michael Luther King and Alberta Williams, Martin Luther King Jr. would grow to become one of America's greatest leaders. According to an article on GeorgiaEncyclopedia.org, King Jr. graduated high school at 15, college at 19, and later that year was ordained. In 1955, he was elected president of the MIA, which stands for Montgomery Improvement Association, making him the leader of the bus boycott that started when Rosa Parks wouldn't give up her seat. Soon after came more civil rights movements, which meant more jail time for King. In August 28, 1963, came the March on Washington. Nearly 250,000 people attended. That day, the great Martin Luther King Jr. gave his most famous speech, I Have a Dream.
This morning, we will give you some information on our speaker, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I Have a Dream speech. We will give you some information on the significance of his speech, the communication concepts that he used in his speech, and why he inspired us as a great speaker.
There's so much significance to Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. He has many historical references to Abraham Lincoln. It was performed at the Lincoln Memorial on August 28, 1963. The speech begins very similar to Abraham Lincoln's famous speech, where Abraham Lincoln started out the Gettysburg Address 7 years ago. And Martin Luther King Jr., 100 years later, started his out 50 years ago. It also has a reference to the Emancipation Proclamation, which helped free slaves during the Civil War. It was a tumultuous time in civil rights history when Martin Luther King performed his speech. It was less than a decade after Plessy versus Ferguson was overturned by Brown versus the Board of Education, which declared separate but equal as being unconstitutional. He was also a very peaceful civil rights activist. Barack Obama said, "I make this statement mindful of what Martin Luther King said in the same ceremony years ago." He quotes him saying, "Violence never brings permanent peace. It solves no social ceremony, no social problem. It merely creates new and more complicated ones." Obama continues on to say, "As someone who stands here as a direct consequence of Dr. King's life work, I am living testimony to the moral force of nonviolence. I know there is nothing weak, nothing passive, nothing naive in the creed and lives of Gandhi and King." There is such a huge effect from Martin Luther King's speech on the nation during the present time and also in years to follow. According to Let's Look at the District of Columbia, an article by Stokely in 2010, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his I Have a Dream speech to a crowd of 200,000 people. Martin Luther King not only touched everyone who was there at the rally that day, but those to come for decades, and we're still studying him now. Buffano, in his 2006 article, The Power of Language, said, "Martin Luther King Jr.'s iconic phrase, 'I have a dream,' is the perfect example. Even setting aside the powerful context of the event in which he spoke, the language he used clearly identified Martin Luther King as a leader." Flumer later goes on to say, "His carefully crafted words powerfully conveyed the passion of his beliefs, and he earned a place in history for helping to right a great wrong in our nation."
Christian Science monitors 10 of Dr. Martin Luther King's quotes. They state that he appeals to people's emotion. Martin Luther King Jr.'s quotes on love, justice, humane purpose changed the way that America and the world thought of race and demonstrated the power of nonviolence. He overcame even the most entrenched prejudices. USA Today reports on an article remembering Martin Luther King's legacy that a person's speech patterns are the product of his or her experiences, including region and social settings. NobelPrize.org states that Martin Luther King Jr. majored in theology at Boston University. It is no wonder that in most of his speeches, his concepts were focused on beliefs, ideas, and theories. He used metaphors in his speech with concrete images of emotion. For instance, he evokes the contrasting metaphor of dark and desolate to the valley of segregation, a joyous daybreak to the end of a long night of captivity. A speech analysis done by Andrew Dugan reports that much of his speech is tied to his historical context. He began his speech 54 years ago, which refers to Lincoln's famous Gettysburg Address speech, which began 47 years ago. He was speaking in front of the Lincoln Memorial. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is a reference to the United States Declaration of Independence. Also, in his I Have a Dream speech, he used repetition. I have a slide in I Have a Dream speech can be summarized in this view, which associates the size of the word with its frequency in the speech. For instance, dream was used 11 times, freedom was used 20 times, we 30 times, justice 8. His key phrases were, now is the time, with this faith, we can never go back. Repetition makes these phrases more memorable.
I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious races, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words political position and nullification. One day right down in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted. Every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is the faith that I go back to the South with.
Martin Luther King had great powers of communication. He spoke with a strong voice and used a lot of hand gestures. He appealed to black men as well as white. He states, we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. He encourages and empowers his audience not to wallow in the valley of despair.